All right, so now I'll describe how I kind of moved from probably 2016 to 2020. I was a right winger, and then I'll describe my transition again to the left wing in 2020. But I'll just describe a little bit more about how I feel like my grandpa kind of moved me toward the right wing. Like one example is my grandpa told me about how his interpretation of the story of the Garden of Eden, and his interpretation was that the apple represents the apple of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That represents rational, calculative thinking, and as opposed to the flow, right? So now I understand it, but at the time I didn't understand what he meant by the flow. Like, okay, it's transcends the ego and pure awareness. And when he would talk about like pure awareness, I always thought of that as like him being like meditative state, like not thinking, but just being like in like a dull, like meditative state. And I always saw that as kind of like white supremacist, like him trying to condone just awareness, like, because again, I was a Marxist communist, and I was kind of anti-white, and I was like, no, don't just be in pure awareness, don't just be in a dull state of meditation. That's exactly what the white supremacists want. That's exactly what the status quo wants, people to just be in awareness, and then that will just maintain the status quo and maintain white supremacy and stuff. And I was a Marxist, a communist, and I wanted I wanted to destroy religion. And I felt like this idea of like, don't get angry, just be in pure awareness. I thought that was just a way to maintain the status quo. But now I understand what my grandpa's saying, that when you're in pure awareness, or when you're in the flow, you're transcending the ego. And you're like, and because, now I understand that the ego kind of contaminates your vision, and you don't see things purely as the way they are. And then now I know that he's not saying like just being in like a meditative state, but, inspiration thinking. It's thinking beyond thinking, right? It's intuition, inspiration, insight, true awareness of the truth, like pure awareness. And not in terms of like, I thought that he meant like pure awareness isn't like just be dull and be in meditative state, but he never explained things well. But now I know like pure awareness, after reading Dr. Horace's books and stuff and other things, like pure awareness is like transcendence of the ego, so you can see the truth. Now I couldn't see the truth because I was definitely stuck in my ego, and my ego, I saw myself more as Jewish, and I was anti-white, and I wanted race mixing. But I thought that was like progressive, right? Or I acted like it was progressive, but really I had an agenda, right? And I had an ego agenda. But so my grandpa's, describing that the garden and the fruit, the story of the fruit in the garden of good or in the Garden of Eden, the fruit of good and evil, that represents calculative thinking, like thinking of like what's right and what's wrong, like what's good and what's bad, and calculative thinking. And according to Dr. Hora, there's the quote by Paul in the Bible where he says, "The good I would I do not, and that which I would not I end up doing." So calculative thinking ends up backfiring. And one example was like the story of the Star Wars, where Luke Skywalker's, he tries to save Padme, but he ends up killing her, right? He's using calculative thinking. He's trying to make things happen. He's not in the flow. He's in fear-based thinking, right? He's stuck in the ego. He's not in pure awareness. And then he ends up creating what he didn't want to create. He wanted to save Padme's life, but he ends up killing her. And I remember at this time in my life, I'll get more to that, the whole Star Wars thing, but yeah, so my grandpa was saying that that's what the fruit represents, and and so the story of Garden of Eden was about transcending calculative thinking, rational calculative thinking, to the flow, transcendence of the ego, and that would be the tree of life. That would be the flow. And now, but when I was a Marxist communist, I remember, like I said, I appropriated my grandpa's teachings, but in my anti-white lens, in my anti-white Marxist lens. So like, I wanted to see the Garden of Good and Eden as, or Garden of Eden as, representing, I thought that God was kind of an evil, right? And I remember listening to a black woman talk about this, like this is her interpretation as well, because she was probably a communist, Marxist, anti-white person too. But, like I saw God as evil, right? I was kind of like a Gnostic, and I was like, yeah, the Garden of Eden just represents a prison, and knowledge of good and evil, that's good. You're not just in awareness, and you're not just like sitting there like, oh yeah, I'm just in ignorance, right? And you start to think, and you try to break out of the status quo, and you try to break out of your imprisonment. And I thought that religion was like imprisonment. It was white supremacy and all that, right? And you want to break out, and I saw God as kind of like evil, like the Gnostics saw it, right? And he's like holding everybody down, and he's holding everybody in. He's maintaining white supremacy. Like I always saw religion as white supremacist. And so like I wanted to be like, yeah, and actually being bad is actually good, because when you're bad, you're breaking out of, like my grandpa talked about. A good shooter, like when I was a really great shooter, I wasn't doing what the coaches said, but I also wasn't not conforming, because not conforming is not the flow, but also conforming is not the flow. But I was, doing what was perfect, that you can't teach it. I was in the flow. But the thing is but I wanted to believe that well, at least non-conformity is closer to the flow. Because if you're in conformity, my grandpa taught right, if you're in conformity, then, you might just, because conformity is socially sanctioned, so you might always be in conformity. And as Jesus said, right, Jesus said in the Bible, he says something like, either be hot or cold and not lukewarm. If you're lukewarm, I'll spit you out. And if you're in just conformity, if you're just lukewarm, then you're never going to get in trouble, and you're never going to get into the flow, right? Because you'll have social sanction, and you're just content, and you'll never be in the flow, and you'll always be stuck in the illusion of being a separate self, right? So I wanted to, misappropriate my grandpa's teachings and be like, yeah, being bad is actually good, because then you're, non-conformity is closer to the flow. So and I was like, and that's why Adam and Eve, were chosen, because God knew that they would disobey, and disobedience is actually closer to the flow, because obedience is not the flow. Obedience is the second quadrant. Belief, which is conformity, which isn't the flow. And the flow is the fourth quadrant, which is the opposite of the second quadrant, right? That's the way I wanted to see it. And I wanted to be like, yeah, and that's why God chose the Israelites, because the Israelites were bad, and they didn't obey, and they were disobedient, right? And they weren't perceptive, which is the first quadrant, and sensitive, which is the first quadrant. And I was like, the first and second quadrant are the good quadrants, but I always wanted to flip everything on its head and make the good bad. So that's conformity and belief, which is life, and it's like conformity and community. But I wanted to make the third quadrants and fourth quadrants, which are bad, like thinking, emotion, doing, dreaming, and contemplation, passion, flowing, knowing, those are actually good. The bad is actually good. And I want to be like, yeah, that's when you break out of the containment, the prison of the Garden of Eden, and, and that's actually closer to the flow, right? And I was like, and that's why God chose the Israelites, because God knew the Israelites would be disobedient. But if you look in the Bible, the faithful Gentiles, they're always destroyed. Like, Pharaoh, he believes in God, but he's destroyed, and Egypt's destroyed. Or the Romans, they believe in God, but the Rome is destroyed by Jesus. I wanted to believe, right? Because I was anti-white, and I wanted to destroy white people and mix with white people. So I was like, the obedient white people are actually the bad ones. They're not in the flow. But it's not necessarily true, not really true necessarily. But that was because I saw myself as Jewish, and I wanted to mix the white people, and I wanted to make them bad. So I was like, yeah, but I want to make the black people who are bad, or the Jewish people who are bad and disobedient, right? They're actually good, because that's actually closer to the flow. And I wanted to believe that that's what the Bible actually taught. And that's why Adam was chosen, because God knew he would disobey. And that's why the Israelites are chosen, because God knew they would disobey. And and by disobeying, they're actually being good, because they're closer to the flow, right? And then I wanted to look at the story of the prodigal son as an example of that. He's bad, but that actually being bad is good. And my grandpa would later teach me because the prodigal son, he goes out and then he expands his awareness, and he's sinning and stuff, but at least he's expanding his awareness. Whereas the son who stays in the house, he's just in conformity, and he never learns. So he's not in the flow. So I want to make things like the bad is good and the good is bad, right? And because I had a race mixing agenda, and I wanted to make white people bad and black people good, and the darker race is good. I was a Marxist communist, and that's the way I wanted to see the Garden of Eden. But my grandpa, his thing was, and I always thought my grandpa was a white supremacist, and he was, and again, he's like, no, it represents, the garden, the tree of life is pure awareness, in the eating the fruit from the tree of knowledge is calculated rational thinking, which is ego-based, and which is sensory-based, and which is negative. And you want to transcend that to the flow, or to pure awareness. But when my grandpa talked about pure awareness, I'd be like, yeah, you're just a typical white supremacist. You just want people to be in a meditative state and just accept their lot and not be Marxist, and, not get angry. And, my grandpa would talk about anger's not the flow. But I was like, no, you should be angry, when I was a leftist, I was like, you should be angry, you know, you should try to destroy the status quo, and you know, because I was against the white people, right? And you know, the black people are stereotypically angry and, you know, rappers and, you know, violent and stuff like that. And I wanted to make that good. Like, they're actually good ones. They're the ones who are actually going to go to heaven because it's closer to the flow. Whereas the white people are conformists, or in conformity, and who are into belief and faith and, you know, maintaining the status quo. They're actually they're the devils, right? I wanted to invert everything and subvert everything. But so anyways, this is my grandpa's teaching. But now I understand it, that my grandpa wasn't saying like pure awareness is just like meditative state, but he was saying like, yeah, the fruit from the tree of life, as opposed to the tree of knowledge, you know, of good and evil, which is calculative thinking. You know, the fruit from the tree of life is, you know, is the flow, which is transcendence of the ego. And I didn't realize that because I saw myself as Jewish. I was so trapped in my ego and I couldn't see the truth. And I couldn't see the negative consequences of my, you know, dualistic software where I want to destroy white people, which is a predatory software toward white people. But so my grandpa was teaching me this stuff, and this, again, like, this stuff was moving me more toward the spiritual way and more toward right wing. And another example of this would be like, I asked my grandpa, at this time I started studying Hinduism, and I would like ask my grandpa, what do you think is the meaning of, you know, when Krishna kills this guy and then he cuts the guy in half and then he throws the one half this way and one half that way? My grandpa would be like, well, that's transcendence of dualistic software, because, you know, he took away the halves, but then he would have to throw one way and one the other way so that they couldn't come back together. And it was about transcending dualism. But at the time, again, my grandpa never really taught me what that meant. So when I'm thinking like transcend dualism, I'm thinking they just being like, okay, yeah, just be a religious person and just be in pure awareness, meditative state, woo, 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 you know, and just like and I was also like anti-Marxist. Like, I thought that thinking was good. My grandpa would be like, no, thinking is not good. Thinking is a third quadrant, right? But I wanted, in third quadrant's bad, but I wanted to make the bad good, right? So I'm like, no, thinking is good, because then you break free of, you know, conformity, and you break free of white supremacy and the status quo and stuff, and you want to think and you want to be a Marxist, right? I was a Marxist when I was a leftist. But then my grandpa was like, no, transcend dualistic software. So I'm starting to move more toward the right wing and more pro-white, and I'm thinking like, okay, but I didn't really understand what he meant by that. Now I understand, because he didn't explain things well. But now I understand, okay, dualistic software. Dualistic software is you believe that you're a self and that there's other selves, but really everything is one and there is no thing. And it's about transcending the ego so that you can have pure awareness or awareness of the truth, right? But at the time, I didn't really understand that. And now, so I'm like, okay, transcend dualistic software. Okay, that sounds good, Grandpa. So like, let's just be meditative state and not get angry. And, you know, I was becoming more religious, right? And like less of a communist, more of a nationalist white supremacist, right? But now I understand, you know, the more transpersonal, you know, the higher meaning of it. But at the time I didn't, because my grandpa didn't explain things well. So like another example would be, I remember there was this story of like Krishna taking the gopi women's clothes. And I was like, what does this represent, Grandpa? My grandpa's like, well, it represents transcending the ego, because the clothes represent your ego and your identity. And when you're in the flow, you transcend your identity, you transcend your ego and stuff. So I'm like, okay, you know, these are interesting ideas. But again, like, I was becoming more religious, right wing. But I will get to that, how that kind of confused me, because it seems a little bit left wing to like transcend your ego. But again, like when I would think of transcending your ego, I'm like, okay, yeah, so don't get angry, you know, just be religious and just you know, accept things and be in meditative state. But now I understand transcend your ego would be, there is no formula for the flow. Like when you really transcend your ego, you can be an inspiration and, you know, transcend the limitations of, you know, your identity, which can limit and confine and restrict your awareness, right? Because like me, when I saw myself as Jewish, I was against white people and stuff, and I had a restricted consciousness, and it inclined me toward being materialistic and Marxist and stuff, and not seeing the whole picture, the whole array, as it were, you know. So like this, so you know, my grandpa taught me that one, and so I was asking like, what does this mean? What do you think this means? And I asked my grandpa like, what do you think it means because I started studying Hinduism more at this point, right? I started watching like serials on YouTube, right, on Hinduism, right, like Sri Krishna serials and Mahabharata serials, right? And another example would be like, you know, Krishna would steal the butter, the ghee, Now, the Marxist interpretation, which I looked up online, was the people who are more people of color, like the Indian people who are more people of color. They would be like, yeah, the reason why Krishna stole the butter was because he was against the evil, the rich evil people like Kamsa. And like it's what Nietzsche talked about, like the anti-rich thing, like. And when I was a anti-white supremacist, Marxist, I was always like anti-rich, and that was my interpretations of the religious scriptures, always like the Bible and everything, because I saw things through that lens, because I was anti-white and I saw myself as Jewish and I wanted to destroy white people, and I see white people as more like, conformity and rich and like good and status quo, right? But my grandpa's like, so one interpretation that people would say is, yeah, Krishna stole the butter because the butter was what was the taxes for that Kamsa took, and Kamsa was this rich ruler, and basically Krishna was a Marxist and he wanted to destroy the rich and destroy his evil tyrant uncle, almost like a proletariat revolution against the bourgeoisie. And when I was a communist, that's the way I would have looked at it. And like, yeah, the people of color should destroy the white people, and Trump is bad, and that type of thing, right? He's a white supremacist, That's the way that I was. But then when I was there was another interpretation, like, and I forget what it was, but it was something like, the ghee represents the self or the soul, and him eating the ghee represents, transcending the self and transcending the ego. That's like another interpretation of what Krishna was doing that I read. And I was like, well, what one do you think, Grandpa? And my grandpa was like, well, of course, it's just transcending the ego. It's the flow. That's what it represents. And I was like, okay. But again, I didn't really understand what the flow was. I'm like, I was more interpreting in like a religious perspective, like, okay, yeah, just be in the flow and just be in pure awareness and just, don't fight and basically accept the status quo and just work hard and, be in the flow and transcend the self, but in a religious way and like anti-Marxist, right? Like, don't get angry because anger's not the flow, because that's self-confirmatory, and like, I didn't really understand it, but now I understand it, like, more that the idea of the flow is pure awareness, transcending the ego and stuff. And when you're in pure awareness, this is another thing that my grandpa taught, like, there's no formula for the flow, right? So like, and this is where I was started like kind of vacillate, where I was starting to get confused, because my grandpa was kind of moving me toward the right wing, but then I started moving, like, vacillating between right wing and left wing. So like, one thing that was taught is like, Jesus says, turn the other cheek. And I asked my grandpa, what does it mean to turn the other cheek? My grandpa was like, well, it doesn't mean to like accept people beating you up and stuff. That's the, the slave mentality. Like, oh, I'm superior because I'm being beaten up, and here, hit me more, and that's going to make me more superior, and I'll go to heaven because I'm the most abused and I'm the most inferior, and being inferior is actually superior. This is what Nietzsche was against. That slave mentality. But then there's the other guy, this guy named like Walter or whatever, he's a theologian, and he was like, no, turn the other cheek was actually a form of passive aggressive thing where, when you turn the other cheek, you're basically suggesting like it's actually a form of defiance to turn your other cheek. And you're basically telling the person like, hey, you're actually standing up for yourself. So it's like looking at the complete opposite way of a lot of people interpret it, right? But my grandpa would be like, neither one. Turn the other cheek means turn your cheek to a higher consciousness, to the flow, right? So I'm like, huh. But again, I didn't understand the flow at this time. So I was just confused. Like, I'm just like, okay, the flow, is that like pure awareness? He says pure awareness, is that just like a meditative state? But now I understand, like, it's transcendence of the ego. But I was so stuck in my ego, seeing myself as Jewish and stuff, and anti-white, and at this point, remember, I become right wing. So I started becoming more right wing. But when I was like a communist, I was so stuck in my ego and I wasn't able to see it, right? And part of the flow is just being, there's a lot of inquiry involved in being able to see the truth, and a lot of that comes through comprehensivity and studies and stuff like that, and gaining a comprehensive perspective. My grandpa talks about a passion for comprehensivity, right? So, but at this point, I'm just confused. So I'm moving more toward the right wing, right? And more religious and less communist, right? I'm becoming more pro-white, anti-communist, nationalist, But then, so this is around like 2019, and I remember at this time I was kind of pro-Trump, and I was like, I didn't like Bernie Sanders, I saw as a communist Jew, and I didn't like Andrew Yang, who I saw as like a communist Chinese guy or whatever, and I was kind of more of a right winger at this point. So I went from being a communist most of my life to become a right winger, and then going back to a communist, and I became a right winger again. And this is at the time when I was a right winger again. And I'll kind of describe how in 2020 I transitioned back to a communist, leftist. Because again, I didn't really understand what my grandpa's teachings, and I'll kind of describe how my grandpa kind of confused me again, and I became a communist thinking that my grandpa was actually wanting me to become a communist, and he just confused me. So I'll get to that.